Admit the murder or you will see.
The British Empire's history is filled with brutal and disturbing punishment methods designed to instill fear and control. In this video, we explore the most disgusting and inhumane punishments ever used, from terrifying executions to grotesque torture devices. These shocking practices will reveal the dark side of the Empire's rule. Stay tuned for the truth. Banishment. In the 1700s, banishment became a widely used punishment, offering an alternative to the death penalty. Known as transportation, this practice involves sending criminals far from their homeland. Initially, convicts from Britain were transported to America between 1717 and 1776. However, after that ended, Australia became the primary destination. Between 1787 and 1868, over 160,000 convicts were sent to Australia. Judges favored transportation as a middle ground, less severe than execution, but effective in removing criminals from Britain. It was also more economical than maintaining overcrowded prisons or hulks, which were old ships repurposed as jails. Beyond punishment, transportation served Britain's colonial ambitions, helping establish control over Australia's land and build its settlements. The system addressed a pressing issue: Britain's overcrowded prisons. By the time Captain Cook charted Australia in 1770, the country's jails were bursting. Transportation offered a solution, relocating offenders to a remote, rugged territory. Yet, this was no escape. Sentences ranged from 7 years to life, and the journey itself was arduous. Convicts faced harsh conditions aboard ships, and life upon arrival was grueling. They were forced into hard labor in unforgiving environments, with authorities believing such hardships would deter others from crime and perhaps reform the convicts themselves. By 1868, transportation was abolished. Shifting attitudes toward punishment emphasized reform and rehabilitation over exile. Society began focusing on changing criminals rather than simply removing them. Additionally, free settlers in Australia grew increasingly dissatisfied. As more British families emigrated to Australia for new opportunities, they resented the influx of convicts into their communities. Transportation's end marked a turning point in how punishment was viewed, reflecting the evolving ideals of justice and society's responsibility to reform offenders rather than merely banish them. Judas cradle. One of the most horrifying devices of medieval torture was the Judas cradle, sometimes called the Judas chair. Its mere appearance struck terror into the hearts of those who saw it. In many cases, just the threat of this gruesome contraption was enough to make people confess to whatever the interrogators demanded. The Judas cradle was designed as a sharp, pyramid-shaped structure with a pointed tip. Victims were tied up and gradually lowered onto the pyramid's peak using ropes. As their body weight pressed down, the sharp point pierced into their flesh, inflicting excruciating pain. Over time, the tip could tear through the pelvic area, making the experience almost unbearable. This wasn't just an isolated tool of terror. It was widely used across medieval Europe in various forms. While the design differed slightly depending on the region, the purpose remained the same: to break both the body and spirit of the victim. The psychological impact was as powerful as the physical pain. Many prisoners confessed to crimes, true or false, just to avoid the unimaginable agony of the Judas cradle. In many cases, torturers didn't even need to use the device. The sight of the sharp, menacing pyramid was often enough to shatter a person's resolve. The Judas cradle became a symbol of ultimate torment, leaving a dark legacy as one of history's most infamous tools of suffering. Scold's bridal. In the 16th and 17th centuries, punishments often extended beyond breaking the law to targeting behaviors that society disapproved of. In both England and Scotland, one group frequently found themselves punished for what was considered inappropriate behavior: women who gossiped or spoke too much. These women, known as scolds, were seen as troublemakers who disrupted the peace of their communities with loud voices and harsh tales. While today a simple reprimand might be enough to address gossip, back then much more severe methods were used. One such method was the scold's bridle, also called branks. This device was specifically designed to silence women perceived as too outspoken or unruly. It was not only a form of physical punishment, but also an attempt to publicly humiliate the wearer. The bridle resembled a mask, but it was far from something to wear with pride. Often it had unsettling features such as twisted metal designs or even horns, making it appear menacing. Inside the mask, a sharp metal piece was inserted that pressed painfully onto the woman's tongue, preventing her from speaking. The pain was unbearable, and the device forced her to remain silent, regardless of her will. Women subjected to this cruel punishment had to walk through the town, publicly humiliated. Their silence and suffering were meant to teach them a harsh lesson, to deter them from gossiping or speaking too freely in the future. But the Scold's bridle was not just about silencing a woman's words. It served as a broader tool for controlling women who defied the expectations of being quiet and obedient. This punishment reinforced societal norms that sought to keep women in their place, reminding them of the consequences of stepping outside the prescribed boundaries of behavior. Eaten by the flames. The rack and the Judas cradle were brutal, but some medieval punishments were even more horrifying. Among the worst was being burned alive, a fate reserved for those accused of heresy or petty treason. During the reign of King Henry VII, who ruled from 1485 to 1509, 11 individuals met this fiery end for following Lollard teachings, a movement critical of the church and labeled heretical. The Lollards, daring to challenge the dominant religious authority, became targets of relentless persecution. Their beliefs were so reviled that many were paraded to their deaths in horse-drawn carts, a grim spectacle meant to deter others. The mid-14th century image of Lollards being led to execution in England highlights the grave danger of expressing dissent or holding unorthodox beliefs in that era. But executions weren't limited to heretics alone, nor were methods uniform across regions. In Dover, for example, those deemed guilty might be cast from the cliffs, a terrifying plunge to their death. Meanwhile, in Sandwich, burial alive served as a ghastly sentence for certain crimes. Such punishments, both public and extreme, served as chilling warnings, instilling fear in the hearts of the populace. In those times, survival wasn't just about obeying laws. It was about aligning with the prevailing powers. Even a whisper of dissent or a belief that deviated from the norm could seal one's fate. The ever-present threat of such grim punishments meant living in a state of constant apprehension, where the mere perception of wrongdoing could lead to unspeakable consequences. Floggings. From the earliest days of colonial rule, harsh punishments were a grim reality, used to enforce authority and silence dissent. Among these methods, flogging stood out for its brutality. This punishment involved whipping individuals, often using tools like rods, whips, or the infamous cat-o'-nine-tails. While many were subjected to flogging against their will, others voluntarily endured it, driven by religious devotion or personal conviction. The whipping was usually administered on the bare back, though in some cases areas like the feet were targeted, a practice known as bastinado. This form of punishment became so notorious in Britain that it was often referred to as the English vice. The British Navy relied heavily on flogging to maintain discipline aboard its ships. Sailors who violated the strict code of conduct could face severe consequences, ranging from a few lashes to dozens, depending on the gravity of their offense. Typically, a sailor might receive around 19 lashes, but more severe punishments could involve up to 60 strokes. Captain Thomas Masterman Hardy was notorious for issuing harsher sentences, and for particularly grievous offenses, sailors were subjected to the dreaded flogging around the fleet. This public spectacle involved whipping the individual on multiple ships, ensuring that the punishment was both humiliating and a warning to others. The cruelty of flogging sparked heated debates, particularly in 1879 when Britain deliberated over its use in the Navy. During this great cat contention, Member of Parliament John O'Connor Power dramatically requested a cat-o'-nine-tails be brought into the room to emphasize the instrument's barbarity. This pivotal moment helped sway public opinion and lawmakers, ultimately leading to the abolition of flogging in the Navy. The British Army was no stranger to such brutal practices. During the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers often faced hundreds of lashes for infractions. In some cases, sentences could reach as high as 1,200 lashes, an ordeal that was often fatal. Even minor offenses, such as stealing a beehive, could result in hundreds of lashes. These punishments left soldiers physically scarred and emotionally broken, eroding morale and self-respect. Notably, the King's German Legion, a unit of German soldiers allied with Britain, rejected flogging. When a British soldier under their command was sentenced to such treatment, a German officer refused to carry out the punishment, demonstrating that opposition to flogging existed even within military ranks. Despite being banned in many regions, flogging persisted in some places. In Northern Ireland, a 1922 law allowed whipping as a penalty for certain crimes. Frank Morris, a man sentenced to 15 lashes with the cat o' nine tails in 1942, described the excruciating pain, recalling that he resisted the urge to scream. This law remained in effect until 1973, illustrating how the shadow of this brutal practice lingered well into the 20th century. Beyond flogging, other punishments demonstrated the chilling creativity of those in power. One of the most terrifying torture devices was the rack, designed to stretch the human body to its limits. Such methods not only inflicted unimaginable physical agony, but also served as stark reminders of the empire's unyielding control. These punishments, steeped in cruelty, left a dark legacy that continues to haunt the pages of history. Scavenger's daughter. If the rack's horrors weren't enough, the yeoman warders of the Tower of London had another sinister tool at their disposal during the 16th and the 17th centuries. Known as the Scavenger's daughter, this torture device was the opposite of the infamous rack. While the rack stretched victims to agonizing limits, the Scavenger's daughter compressed the body into an excruciatingly contorted position. Invented during the reign of King Henry VIII by Sir Leonard Scavenger, Lieutenant of the Tower, this gruesome device bore various names, including Scavenger's gyves, the stork, and the Spanish A-frame. The contraption's A-frame design bound the victim's head at the top, hands at the midpoint, and legs at the lower end, forcing the body into a brutal compression. The intense pressure often caused victims to bleed from their nose, mouth, and other areas, with death a possible outcome. Today, two variations of the Scavenger's daughter survive as chilling reminders of its cruelty. One, displayed in the Wakefield Tower, binds the body in a kneeling position that would have caused immense discomfort and respiratory issues as blood filled the lungs. The other, housed in the Spanish armories of the White Tower, consists of complex handcuffs that simultaneously grip the neck and ankles, twisting the body into an unnatural and agonizing posture. One of the most notable victims of this device was Thomas Peine, an Irishman accused of conspiring with rebels in 1581. Peine, enduring unimaginable pain, etched his lament on the wall of the Beauchamp Tower. "By torture straying my truth was tried, yet of my liberty denied." Historians believe his words refer to his ordeal with the Scavenger's daughter. Another victim was Thomas Cottam, an English Catholic priest who suffered under this device twice in the 1580s before his eventual release. These accounts reveal the Scavenger's daughter's devastating legacy, a dark testament to the era's brutal methods of control and interrogation. Peine, forte et dure. History is filled with harsh and terrifying punishments, and few were as horrifying as peine, forte et dure, an old French term meaning forceful and hard punishment. This brutal method was reserved for those who refused to plead guilty or innocent. Victims were laid flat, and heavy stones or iron weights were placed on their chest, increasing the pressure until they either spoke or suffocated. The punishment arose from the belief that courts couldn't proceed without a plea. However, silence was sometimes a calculated choice. By refusing to plead, individuals ensured their property remained with their family. A guilty plea, on the other hand, meant forfeiting everything to the crown. For many, this grim trade-off made enduring the excruciating punishment a final act of defiance. Over time, peine, forte et dure fell out of favor. By 1772, it was officially abolished, and silence was treated as an admission of guilt. Decades later, in 1827, legal reforms shifted again, interpreting silence as a plea of not guilty. Despite its rarity, some cases remain infamous. One involved Margaret Clitheroe, who in 1586 chose silence to shield her children from testifying against her. She was pressed to death under 700 pounds of weight, a torment that ended her life in just 15 minutes. Another tragic instance occurred during the Salem witch trials in 1692. Giles Corey, accused of witchcraft, was subjected to the same fate. According to legend, as the crushing weight increased, his final defiant words were, "More weight." Though such punishments are unthinkable today, They serve as a chilling reminder of the brutality that once defined justice. These stories highlight how far society has come in the pursuit of fairness and humanity in the legal system. The rack. In 15th century England, a brutal device known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter emerged, named after the Duke of Exeter, who oversaw the Tower of London. Despite its seemingly gentle name, this torture method was anything but. The rack, as it was also called, was a large rectangular frame where victims were bound by ropes tied to their wrists and ankles. These ropes connected to a crank, which when turned, tightened the ropes, stretching the person's body to agonizing limits. As the crank twisted, joints were wrenched apart, ligaments snapped, and in extreme cases, limbs could even be torn off. The pain was excruciating, designed not only to punish, but to force confessions during interrogations. Victims strapped to the rack were bombarded with questions, and each refusal to answer was met with another turn of the crank, intensifying the torture. Most couldn't withstand the agony for long and would eventually reveal their secrets just to end the suffering. The rack left its victims physically broken and mentally scarred, serving as a grim symbol of the lengths authorities went to extract information. It stands as a haunting reminder of the cruelty of medieval interrogation practices. Yet it wasn't the only terrifying tool of its time, as history is rife with other devices designed to instill fear and inflict unimaginable pain. Jibbing. As history unfolded, the punishments handed out by the British Empire grew more brutal and inhumane. If you thought the ducking stool was harsh, wait until you hear about jibbing, a form of punishment that not only caused immediate suffering, but left a permanent, macabre reminder for all to see. Jibbing was a chilling practice during the harsh rule of the British Empire, a method where a criminal's body was displayed for the public as a lasting warning. While jibbing could take place with devices like a guillotine or chopping block, it became most notorious when a convicted criminal's lifeless body was hung in chains on a special structure called a gibbet. One notable instance of jibbing occurred in Elsdon, Northumberland, at Winter's gibbet. The story of William Winter is particularly haunting. In 1792, Winter was hanged in Newcastle after being convicted of murdering an elderly woman. But his punishment did not end with death. His body was put on display, suspended in chains on a gibbet for the public to see. His rotting corpse remained there for years, a grotesque symbol of punishment, until the structure eventually collapsed. By 1867, a replica was erected on the same spot, complete with a wooden figure to represent what the scene had once looked like. Over the years, parts of the figure, including the head and body, disappeared. Today, all that remains is a small chain, serving as a stark reminder of the grim history tied to that location. Strangely, people once believed that touching parts of the gibbet could bring about healing. It was thought that rubbing the wooden structure against sore gums could cure toothaches. In Suffolk, at Potsford Woods near Wickham Market, the remains of another gibbet can still be seen. This site carries another tragic tale. A man named Jonas Snell murdered a man and his son while they worked. Caught with the weapon still in his possession, Snell was sentenced to death. He was dragged on his back up a hill to the gibbet, and this hill eventually became known as Dragar's Hill in memory of his grim fate. These stories of jibbing serve as dark chapters in the history of punishment, showing just how far the British Empire went to instill fear and enforce control. Cucking and ducking stool. After the Scold's bridal, one might think punishments couldn't get any worse, but history often has a way of surprising us. As early as the 13th century, England introduced the cucking stool, which later evolved into the even more brutal ducking stool in the 17th century. These harsh and bizarre devices were used to punish not just women, but they became most infamous for targeting women accused of witchcraft, misconduct, or violating societal norms. The cucking stool was a public punishment designed to humiliate. It resembled an old wooden seat, not unlike a toilet, where the accused was strapped into place. Once tied down, the person would be paraded through the town, the crowds jeering and laughing at their misfortune. The punishment wasn't just physically uncomfortable, it was meant to strip the individual of dignity, forcing them to endure shame in front of the entire community. As cruel as the cucking stool was, the ducking stool was even worse. Imagine being strapped into a chair, which was then fastened to a long wooden beam, hanging precariously over a river or pond. Once secured, the chair would be dunked into the water, forcing the person to hold their breath and hope for a quick pull back up. If they survived the dunking, it was seen as a punishment sufficient enough to serve as justice. However, if the person drowned, particularly in cases of witchcraft, it was considered proof of their innocence. The logic behind this twisted form of justice was that if they sank, they were innocent. If they floated, they were guilty. But of course, the ones who sank were not given a chance to live to hear the verdict. This cruel reasoning was part of the darker side of history. Women accused of witchcraft had little to no means of defending themselves. The system offered them no fair chance. If they survived, they were punished. If they died, they were declared innocent, but only in death. Execution by firing squad. Execution by firing squad has long been associated with military justice, particularly during times of war. Serious offenses such as desertion or espionage often led to this grim fate. During the World Wars, the firing squad was a significant instrument of discipline, with the Tower of London playing a notable role in these executions. Between 1914 and 1916, during World War I, 11 German spies were executed at the Tower. 9 faced the firing squad on the Tower's rifle range, while 2 were executed in the Tower ditch. Their final resting place is the East London Cemetery. The last execution at the Tower took place on August 15, 1941, when Josef Jakobs, a German corporal found guilty of espionage during World War II, was shot. His execution chair remains preserved, a haunting relic of that dark chapter. Not all executions during wartime were straightforward. In World War I, 346 British and Imperial soldiers faced execution for crimes like desertion and cowardice. Among them were 25 Canadians, 22 Irish soldiers, and 5 New Zealanders. Many of these men were later understood to have suffered from combat stress, known at the time as shell shock. Their actions, likely driven by fear, confusion, or trauma, reflected the devastating mental toll of war. Decades later, groups like the Shot at Dawn campaign sought to uncover the truth about these cases. Their advocacy led to the establishment of the Shot at Dawn Memorial in Staffordshire, honoring these soldiers and acknowledging the unjust treatment they endured. In 2006, the British government officially pardoned 306 of these men, a symbolic gesture to restore their dignity and recognize their struggles. This act serves as a reminder of the complexities of war and the need for compassion in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Bloody Code. In 1723, Britain introduced the Bloody Code, a harsh legal system that made over 200 offenses punishable by death. What's shocking is that many of these crimes were minor by today's standards, such as stealing a sheep or damaging a garden. The infamous Waltham Black Act was initially created to stop poachers from stealing deer in royal forests, but it quickly expanded to criminalize other acts, including disguising oneself with black paint on the face. This law was just the beginning of a wave of legislation that would label even trivial actions as capital crimes. The list of offenses grew rapidly, turning even everyday misdeeds into hanging offenses. For instance, destroying a bridge, setting fire to property, or stealing a horse could all lead to execution. The legal system became increasingly complex, with overlapping rules for similar crimes. For example, there were 7 different laws addressing arson, each carrying the death penalty. People could face execution for stealing from a shipwreck, snatching a rabbit, or taking items worth as little as a shilling. About 30 euros in today's money. Some laws were even stranger. Walking at night with a blackened face or being an unmarried mother who concealed a stillborn baby could result in a death sentence. However, juries often balked at enforcing these draconian laws, especially for minor offenses. Many juries refused to convict individuals if it meant condemning them to death, leading to fewer executions than the law technically required. Reform eventually came, thanks in large part to Sir Samuel Romilly. He campaigned tirelessly against the Bloody Code, successfully advocating for the repeal of the death penalty for some lesser crimes. Over time, alternative punishments such as imprisonment or transportation to penal colonies became more common. The decline of the Bloody Code marked a turning point in Britain's justice system, signaling the beginning of a shift toward more humane forms of punishment. If you found these horrifying punishment methods shocking, Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more disturbing historical tales. Share your thoughts in the comments below and stay tuned for more.